So nobody wants to die, but most of us, I think, do have an idea of what would be our ideal or, a preferred situation for how we would eventually meet our death. And the question I want to ask in this video is, what was that for a medieval knight? Most people thinking about knights, they would think the obvious answer would be some brave death in battle. Yes, this makes perfect sense. And indeed, in the popular literature of the time, in the ethos of the day, this would have been the most celebrated, the most honorable way to meet your end, to die in some valiant cause, to die honorably. An example of this would be the Song of Roland. This is a very popular poem from the 12th through 14th centuries. This poem depicts one of Charlemagne's men, Roland, during a campaign in Spain. Roland is leading the rear guard. The rear guard is ambushed by a large Muslim army. Roland stands strong to the end, and in fact, he refuses to call for help because he feels it would be dishonorable. So this kind of shows us something about this resolute death, standing there in the face of an impossible situation, but yet fighting to the end. Another example of this, Stephen of Blois, the Count of Blois, one of the leaders of the First Crusade. He is well known because he's one of the leaders who in fact deserted the First Crusade. When they were at the Siege of Antioch, this was the darkest days of the Crusade. It looked like they were not going to make it. Stephen decided to cut his losses and head back home. Now, of course, the First Crusade turned out to be a huge success, so this put Stephen in this position of being totally disgraced. What did he do? Well, he went back to the Holy Land. He rejoined the Crusades. In fact, during the Battle of Ramla, the Second Battle of Ramla in 1102, he was with the army of King Baldwin I of Jerusalem. He died in that battle, and so he essentially completely redeemed his reputation. So he went from being a totally disgraced, dishonored man to being a man who died bravely in a very worthy cause at the Battle of Ramla. The thing we have to remember is that death in battle was not that common in the Middle Ages. Why is this? Battles were rare. Battles were not that common. I think a lot of people, when they're thinking of the Middle Ages, they think, okay, well, yeah, this is a time of warriors, of knights, everybody must have died in battle. But no, battles did not take place that frequently. You think about how a battle would have to happen. You've got to have two armies fully mustered in the field, and both commanders have to feel fairly confident that they can win. Not that common of a situation. And on top of that, a crushing defeat was fairly rare as well. So in most battles, what would happen is, okay, one side gains the advantage fairly early on. The other side says, okay, we can see where this is going, and so they're going to retreat. And so even if you're defeated in battle, that doesn't mean necessarily that you or a lot of your comrades are going to die. Most of you can probably retreat. So a lot of knights, a lot of the nobility probably could expect to die of natural causes, to die of illness, to die as, older men in their beds in their 50s, 60s, 70s. This would be, living to a ripe old age at this time. So how did a medieval knight die well in times of peace? I think if we look at the medieval nobility, we can see the strong preoccupation with the future, in fact. For one thing, the future of your soul, so how you will spend eternity. And secondly, this preoccupation with the future of those you'll leave behind, the destiny of your family, your heirs. There's this overriding need to live up to your feudal obligations, to leave an orderly house, to ensure the security of your heirs and their inheritance, and to provide for your military entourage. So your own knights, the men in your immediate circle, your military household, these were the guys who kind of gave you your immediate power in life. You would want to provide for them. I want to read this passage from John Gillingham's book about Richard the Lionheart. This is about William Marshall, who was a famous knight from the Middle Ages. Gillingham says, when William Marshall was dying, a clerk tried to persuade him to sell about 80 fine robes in order to spend the money for the salvation of his soul. The old man was not persuaded. It had been his custom every year at Pentecost to distribute robes to the knights whom he maintained in his household. Such acts of largesse were part of his duty as a good lord. He rounded angrily upon the clerk. "Be quiet, you tiresome idiot. Have you no sense of shame? Pentecost is at hand, and my knights should have their new robes. This is the last time that I shall be able to supply them. Yet you try to stop me." I think that's a pretty telling passage there. So I think a lot of people would, when they're thinking of the Middle Ages, they would think, okay, well, this was a very religious period of time. The only thing you'd be thinking about is, I'm going to save my soul. I've got to do what I can to ensure the future of my soul. But here we can see that Marshall is just as concerned about his obligations as a lord. I think it makes perfect sense that William Marshall, and really any lord in his situation, would be very concerned to provide for his military entourage, the knights who had made up his inner circle during his life. For one thing, this is a matter of honor. It's important that you provide for these men. This is a legacy you're leaving behind. But also on top of that, these are probably going to be the men who are going to make up the household of your heirs. So you're leaving this to your son. These guys are going to be there to serve your son now. They are going to help create power for him. Death for the medieval aristocrat was kind of a final moment of ceremony and generosity. This is a time to gather all of the household and vassals together at the deathbed. This was sort of a public thing, in fact. The deathbed became kind of the final occasion for the entire, membership of that particular feudal arrangement to get together to proclaim their final loyalties, to proclaim their unity in the face of this. And because that wasn't guaranteed, in fact, this is something that the Lord would want to get out of his vassals. But death could be a very dangerous time in a feudal establishment. This is a time when maybe certain factions would say to themselves, okay, we're going to make our move now. We're going to see if we can seize power. So this is a common theme you see, is that a lord will want to get loyalty from his vassals. He will want to ensure that his vassals show their loyalty toward his heirs. Another good example of this would be King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, one of the famous Crusader kings. He had no sons, so he arranged for his eldest daughter, Melisande, to marry an important prince from the west, Fulk V, the Count of Anjou, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men of his day. So he comes to Jerusalem, and he is married to Melisande, and they have a son, the future Baldwin III of Jerusalem. So he's named for his grandfather. The year before Baldwin II dies, Baldwin III is born. So Baldwin II, he has the kingdom declare its loyalty to not only his daughter and son-in-law, but also to his grandson. So he really leaves a very strong, situation for his heirs before his death. Once a medieval nobleman had taken care of his affairs in the world he's leaving behind, he would be thinking about the world he's about to enter, the world of eternity. One thing we see pretty commonly with the medieval nobility is this practice of renouncing the world, laying aside the trappings of one's station, and taking up a monastic role, in fact, taking the vows of a monk, of a Templar, something like this. This is another passage related to William Marshall. A poem composed in honor of William Marshall of England, who died in 1219, gives one of the most detailed accounts we have from this period of the death of a prince. Wishing to die at home, William had himself transported to one of his manors. When his illness took a turn for the worse, he convoked his relatives and friends, and in particular his eldest son, so that he might be seen arranging his inheritance and choosing his tomb, then changing his clothes, donning those of a Templar, becoming a full-fledged member of another fraternity, and in tears kissing his wife for the very last time. Once this farewell scene was over, the audience dwindled. Still, the dying man was never left alone. Night and day people watched over him as he gradually rid himself of all his possessions. Once he had relinquished the patrimony, he disposed of all his personal belongings, money, jewels, clothing. He paid his debts and begged pardon of those he had wronged in life. He turned his thoughts to his soul and confessed his sins. Finally, on the eve of death, the gates of heaven began to open. William saw two men dressed in white take up positions alongside him, one to his left, the other to his right. The next day at noon, he bade farewell, this time in private, to his wife and knights. So notice his wife and his knights are there with him, not just his wife. I pledge you to God, I am no more. I can defend myself against death no longer. He thus departed the group whose leader he had been. Divesting himself, he transferred his power to God. For the first time since birth, he was alone. A lot of interesting themes there. For one thing, we see this idea that his station, as a lord, was a temporary thing. This was something that at death he was putting this aside. The thing that was eternal was the state of the soul, the relationship to God. In these final moments, the people that he's, saying goodbye to are his wife and his knights. So we've talked about this in other videos, the importance of one's military entourage. These were almost like other sons to this guy. These men are very important to him. So he's saying goodbye to them, his wife and his knights, and at that point he faces God alone. So he's no longer in this role of being a lord, of being the head of a vast household. He's now alone, a soul going before God. This is a common theme in accounts of death for knights in the Middle Ages, is that the people around you would be your immediate family, your wife, your children, but also your knights, your men. And it might even be the situation that it would just be your knights because the medieval nobility traveled frequently. You might die in a situation where you are away from your family members, so the only men around you would be your immediate military entourage who went with you everywhere. The account of Godfrey of Bouillon's death is kind of has this theme. He dies while in the midst of campaigning or doing a lot of stuff. And he kind of retires to this little house, and he's surrounded by his knights, his men. And in fact, they hold him in their arms as he's dying. They're kind of all like there in a circle with him laying there, and they're kind of holding him there. It's this, this is this final moment where he's with the men who were always around him, who fought with him, who provided his military support throughout his life. Medieval aristocrats tend to be people who think very long term. Our leaders today tend to think in terms of election cycles. Medieval aristocracy thought in terms of generations, in terms of almost an eternal type perspective. So the dead continued to be important for a high-ranking medieval household. In fact, they remained a part of the family in a lot of ways. They would be honored on the anniversaries of their birth and their deaths. And we can see this thing where important medieval families would bury the members of their household in these abbeys or churches that were designated as the resting place for the family. So you would have an abbey that was filled with the tombs of various members of a particular high-ranking family. Kings and queens obviously had this as well for their families. And this would make sense too, because an abbey was a place where the monks or the nuns could pray for the souls of that family. So I hope you guys are doing well in these uncertain times we're living through. Before I go, I'd like to say thanks to a few people. Other Realm Productions and Alexander Knight, who have done a lot lately for the channel. They have been helping me create some excellent video game footage for the videos. Other Realm Productions has a great channel. If you guys would check that out, I'll have the link below. Also, thanks to Little Dunmow Company for help with scenes of live action reenactment of medieval knights. Thanks as well to Levi Barros for doing some great narration for me lately. And finally, thanks to everybody who's been supporting me on Patreon and just everybody who subs to the channel. So thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Stay safe, stay at home. Talk to you soon.